The storm struck the Bighorn Mountains with a violence that felt almost personal, as if winter itself had risen from the earth to claim every living thing still breathing. Snow whipped sideways in furious sheets, erasing the world beyond a few trembling feet. The wind shrieked through the pines like a desperate warning, bending their dark silhouettes until they bowed to the storm's merciless will. Inside a lonely cabin tucked against the mountainside, Elias Walker fought to secure the shutters, his fingers raw from the cold and his breath burning in his chest. Someone was out there. He couldn't see it yet, but he felt it. A disturbance carried by the wind, a thud swallowed by the snow, a presence pressing at the edge of the storm. And whatever it wasn't leaving. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The wind slammed against the cabin once more, rattling the wooden beams like a giant testing the structure's resolve. Elias stepped away from the shutters, listening. His instincts had never failed him, not during years of ranching, not during the long, bitter nights after his wife died, not even during the run-ins with drifters who thought a man living alone was easy prey. No. Elias trusted his senses more than anything, and right now, they told him something alive was fighting for its last breath outside. He grabbed his lantern, though the flame inside flickered nervously as if begging to be left by the fire. Elias ignored it, pulled on his heavy coat, and braced himself as he opened the door a crack. A blast of icy wind punched through the gap, nearly knocking him backward. Snow swirled into the room, scattering across the wooden floor like shattered glass. He stepped outside. The world had vanished into white, a swirling void where sky, ground, and air merged into one blinding storm. Elias had lived through dozens of Wyoming winters, but tonight felt different. There was a strange weight in the air, a sense that the storm carried more than cold. He lowered the lantern, shielding the flame with his hand, and listened again. There. A faint, muffled sound coming from the gate. The same soft impact he thought he'd imagined earlier. His boots sank deep into the drifts as he pushed forward, each step a battle against the storm. When he reached the gate, he saw nothing at first, but a mound of snow piled against the wooden bars. Then the mound moved. Just a twitch, small, fragile, but unmistakably human. Elias dropped to his knees, brushing away snow with quick, instinctive motions. Beneath the frozen crust, a pale hand appeared, fingers stiffened into a claw-like shape. His breath caught as he swept more snow aside, revealing the limp form of a woman curled against the gate. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with blonde hair tangled and crusted in ice. Her lips were blue, her skin ghostly white. Her clothes were torn in several places, as if she had fled through brambles or worse. Frost clung to her eyelashes like delicate crystals. Her body trembled once, barely noticeable. "Hold on," Elias muttered, more to himself than to her, because she was far past hearing words. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, light as a child, as if the storm had already taken pieces of her. He held her close against his chest, shielding her from the wind as he trudged back toward the cabin. The lantern swayed wildly, its flame nearly extinguishing with every gust. He pushed through the door, kicked it shut behind him, and carried her straight to the hearth. The fire crackled, startled by the sudden rush of frigid air. Elias set her down on a pile of quilts and blankets. Her skin felt like frozen stone beneath his fingers. "Don't die on me now," he murmured. He moved fast. Years of frontier hardship had taught him how to save a life when minutes mattered. He stoked the fire until it roared. He unwrapped her from her frozen coat, careful not to cause more harm. He placed warm stones near her feet, then wrapped her tightly in every blanket he owned. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Elias leaned close, pressing 2 fingers against her neck. A pulse, faint, weak, but there. "Good," he whispered. "You're still here." For a moment, he simply studied her. Who was she? How had she made it this far into the mountains on a night like this? Why were her clothes torn? Why the bruises on her wrists? Questions crowded his mind, but none mattered as much as the simple fact that if he hadn't opened the door when he did, she would have been gone within the hour. The woman stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering. "Easy," Elias said quietly, though he knew she couldn't understand him yet. "You're safe for now." Outside, the wind growled and clawed at the cabin, but Elias remained focused on the fragile life lying near the fire. He warmed water, brewed herbs, and returned to her side. He propped her up just enough to tilt the cup to her lips. The first sip made her choke weakly. "That's it," he said softly. "Slow. Take it slow." Her breathing steadied a little. Her trembling became less violent. Hours passed. Elias didn't sleep. He watched over her the way he once watched over his sick wife, refusing to let anything take another person from him. Near dawn, the storm softened to a hollow whisper. The woman finally opened her eyes. They were a striking, fragile blue, a color that seemed almost too soft for such a harsh world. She scanned the room in confusion, then flinched as her gaze met Elias's. Her voice was barely a whisper, cracking at the edges. Why did you help me?" Elias hesitated. He wasn't a man of many words, but the answer came naturally. "Because no one deserves to freeze alone." She stared at him, confused and afraid. Before he could say anything else, her eyes rolled back, and she fell into an exhausted sleep. Elias sat beside her, the fire casting warm light across her hollowed cheeks. He didn't know who she was, or what nightmare had driven her into the storm, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever had pushed her to the brink wasn't finished yet, and whether he wanted to or not, he was now part of her story. Morning settled over the Bighorn Mountains in a dull gray wash, turning the snow outside Elias Walker's cabin into a flat, unbroken field. The storm had passed, but it left behind deep drifts and a silence so complete it pressed against the windows. Inside, the fire burned low yet steady, casting a soft orange circle across the room. Elias sat just inside that circle, in a chair scarred by years of use. He hadn't slept. All night he had watched the stranger he'd pulled from the snow, waiting for her chest to stop or strengthen. Wrapped in his blankets, she looked like she'd been poured out of the storm itself, pale, hollow, more bone than weight. He rose stiffly and added a log to the coals. Flames licked up, warming the air by slow degrees. He filled the kettle from a bucket, set it near the fire, and glanced at the window. Snow leaned against the glass in a thick white slope. Behind him, cloth rustled. The woman moved under the blankets, fingers shifting weakly, head turning toward the warmth. Her brows pulled together. She took a shallow, sharp breath, and her eyes opened. For a moment, her gaze was cloudy. Then it cleared, taking in the fire, the low ceiling, the shelves, and finally, the tall man standing a few paces away. Fear tightened her features in an instant. She tried to sit up. Pain slammed into her ribs, and she fell back with a choked gasp, one hand pressed to her side. "Easy," Elias said, stepping closer but keeping his voice even. "You're safe." You're in my cabin. The storm's gone. She stared at him, breathing hard. Her voice came out scraped and thin. Where is this? Bighorn Range, he answered. My place is a ways off the main trail. You reached my gate last night and dropped in the snow. I brought you inside. Her eyes moved slowly around the room. Single bed, table, hanging lantern, rifle by the door, back to his face. Was I alone? She whispered. Yes, Elias said. Just you. Something in her expression folded, then straightened again as she forced it down. She swallowed, and her throat worked like it hurt. The kettle began to murmur. Elias poured hot water into a dented tin cup, dropped in a pinch of herbs, and waited until the steam thinned. When he returned to her side, she was staring at the door with the rigid attention of someone who had learned to listen for danger. Can you drink? He asked. She hesitated, then nodded once. He slid an arm behind her shoulders and lifted her carefully. She went stiff at his touch, but didn't pull away. She felt light, the way people did when hunger and fear had already stripped everything extra from them. He held the cup to her lips. She sipped, coughed once, then drank again. Color crept very slowly back into her cheeks. Thank you, she murmured, her voice a little steadier. You're welcome. He laid her back against the folded coat that served as a pillow. For a while the cabin was only fire crackle and wind whisper. The woman watched him with guarded eyes, as if waiting for the cost of his help to appear. Why did you help me? She asked at last. Because you were dying, he said. And because no one should freeze to death alone at a gate someone could open. She held his gaze, testing those words. Slowly, some of the tension left her shoulders, though not all. What's your name? He asked. She hesitated, lips pressing together, then let out a small breath. Clara, she said. Clara Whitmore. Clara, he repeated. I'm Elias Walker. The names sat between them like something nailed into place. The room didn't change, but the space inside it felt different. Not just a man and a stranger anymore, but two people forced into the same circle of firelight by the same hard winter. How long was I here? Clara asked. Since last night, Elias replied. You slept through the worst of it. Your body's still catching up. She turned her head toward the window. The glass, filmed with frost, threw back only white. What if someone comes looking for me? She asked quietly. If they see I'm here, they won't just ride on. Elias thought of the faint, half-filled marks he'd seen at dawn on the ridge beyond his fence. They might have been old tracks. They might not. Then we'll see who they are, he said, and what they want with you. You don't understand, Clara said, eyes sharpening. They don't stop. If they find me here, there won't be a conversation. They? He asked. She looked away. The word seemed too heavy to push out. I can't talk about it yet, she whispered. That's fine, Elias said. You don't owe me your story today. Her brows pulled together. Then why do you care? She asked. About any of this? Because I've been alone when I shouldn't have been, he said. And I'm tired of letting the mountains decide who gets a chance and who doesn't. She studied him for another long moment. Whatever she saw, there was enough. Her hand loosened on the blanket. All right, Clara murmured. I'll stay, for now. Her eyelids sank. This time, when she slipped back into sleep, it was not a collapse into darkness, but a slow surrender to tiredness. Her breathing evened, deep and steady. Elias watched her a moment longer, then turned back to the table. He began chopping potatoes and dried meat into a pot, letting the simple rhythm calm his thoughts. Questions could wait for a while. For the moment, there was only keeping her warm, fed, alive. Outside, beyond the pines and drifts, the valley lay still. Far off, too distant for Clara to hear, the air trembled with a dull, repeating sound. The measured beat of hooves on frozen ground, moving in the direction of Elias Walker's cabin. Clara woke to the smell of simmering broth, its warmth drifting through the cabin like a soft reminder that she was still alive. Morning light seeped through the frosted windows in pale streaks, barely strong enough to reach the hearth. She shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at her bruised ribs. Elias noticed immediately. "You're awake," he said, turning from the stove. "How's your breathing?" Clara tested a deeper inhale. It caught sharply halfway through. "Better than yesterday," she managed. "That's something." He ladled soup into a tin bowl and brought it to her, setting it on a small crate beside the blankets. "Eat slow. Your stomach won't thank you if you rush." She nodded, though the first thing she felt wasn't hunger. It was disorientation. Every detail of the cabin pressed in on her senses. The smell of burning pine, the muted creak of the rafters, the faint whistle of wind sneaking through the seams in the wall. It was safe here, warmer than anywhere she'd been for days, yet she couldn't keep her hands from trembling. Elias stepped back, but didn't sit. He watched her the way men watched campfires, carefully, as if expecting the smallest shift to reveal something important. Clara tasted the broth. Heat bloomed on her tongue, then down her throat, easing the cold lodged deep in her bones. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. But silence never lasted long with fear. Her gaze drifted toward the window again, toward the endless white she'd stumbled through, toward the direction she prayed she'd never have to face again. Her shoulders tightened, and Elias noticed. "They can't get in without me hearing them," he said. Her spoon paused midair. "That doesn't mean they won't try." He didn't answer right away. "You said there were people after you. Why?" Clara lowered the spoon. She stared at the fire for a long moment, as if searching the flames for something that would make the telling easier. Nothing did. "My town," she finally said, "was called Larkspur Crossing. It was small, quiet. My father ran the blacksmith shop. I helped him since I was old enough to hold a hammer." A faint, tired smile flickered across her lips. "He said metal never lied. You could learn a man by the way his horseshoes wore down." The smile vanished. Her fingers curled into the blanket. "One night a group of outlaws rode in. Silas Brock, Mason Crow, Jonas Pike. Everyone in Montana knew their names. They said they wanted supplies, but it wasn't supplies they took." Elias didn't move, didn't breathe louder than necessary. He let her continue. They grabbed a neighbor's child first, a little boy who happened to open the door at the wrong moment. Her voice cracked, but she pushed forward. "I fought them. I tried to pull him away. Silas hit me hard. Then he told the others I had spirit, and spirit was worth keeping." The tremor in her hands grew until she had to set the bowl aside. "They tied me to a saddle, took me out with them. The boy was left behind, thank God, but I—" Her voice failed. She swallowed hard. "I don't know what would have happened if the storm hadn't hit. It knocked out one of their horses, spooked the others. They went scrambling, and I cut myself free on a broken stirrup. I ran until I couldn't breathe. I think they expected to find my body frozen by morning." "But you kept moving," Elias said quietly. "I didn't have a choice." Clara pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "I knew they'd come after me. Silas doesn't let people go." Elias considered this. He had seen men like Silas, men who believed fear was a kind of ownership. He also knew what fear like Clara's could do to a person. It hollowed them out, left them jumping at shadows. "You're here now," he said finally. "And they're not." She shook her head. "They always follow. They track by instinct. And if they saw your chimney smoke yesterday—" She couldn't finish. Elias didn't argue. He crossed to the window, lifting the curtain with 2 fingers to look outside. Snow still lay deep across the ground, unbroken except for faint, wind-blurred impressions on the ridge. Too far to identify, too close to ignore. He let the curtain fall. "Can you tell me what they look like? If they ride this way, I'll want to know who's coming." Clara swallowed. "Silas is tall, dark coat, scar on his jaw. Jonas has a limp on his left side. Mason—" She hesitated. "Mason enjoys hurting people. He smiles when he does it." Elias's jaw tightened. Clara watched him. "I can leave," she said softly. "I'll go before they get close. I don't want you hurt because of me." "You're not leaving," he replied, the words firm but not unkind. "But—" "I found you at my gate," he said. "The way I see it, that means something. And until you're strong enough to stand without shaking, you're not stepping into that snow again." Her breath trembled, not from cold, but from disbelief. People didn't protect strangers without asking something in return. Not in her experience. "Why?" she whispered. Elias didn't look away. "Because someone should have protected you that night. Since they didn't, I will." The cabin fell quiet again, but the silence felt different. Less like fear, more like space she didn't have to fill. Outside, the wind shifted. The faint echo of hooves, too distant to be certain, too heavy to ignore, carried across the frozen valley. Clara's eyes lifted sharply. Elias heard it too. Not yet close, not yet a threat, but moving, and moving toward them. The danger was no longer a memory. It was on its way, step by steady step. And both of them knew that whatever arrived next would change the shape of the mountains, the cabin, and their lives in ways neither could predict. The snow had begun to settle by late afternoon, leaving the mountains washed in pale light. The storm clouds drifted away, revealing long stretches of white that glowed weakly under the winter sun. Inside the cabin, the fire hummed softly, but the calm outside felt deceptive. Too still, too quiet, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Clara sat wrapped in a blanket near the hearth, her eyes fixed on the narrow window. Every small sound made her flinch. The shifting of wood, the groan of the chimney, the creak of Elias's boots on the floor. Fear lived inside her like a second heartbeat. She could hide it for a moment, sometimes 2, but it always returned, tugging at her ribs and throat. Elias noticed. He always noticed, even when he pretended he didn't. "You should rest," he said gently. "Your body's still fighting to heal." Clara didn't look away from the window. "I can rest when I know they're not out there." Elias followed her gaze but saw nothing except an expanse of pale snow. Still, the memory of those faint hoofbeats from earlier weighed on him. Tracks left in the wrong place could mean many things, but Clara's voice, trembling and honest, had stripped the situation of doubt. The danger wasn't imagined. It existed. It hunted. He picked up his coat. "I'll check the ridge," he said. Clara's breath hitched. "Alone? It's safer than waiting to be surprised." Her hands twisted in the blanket, knuckles white. "Be careful. Please." He nodded once, simple, steady, and stepped out into the cold. The moment the door closed, Clara felt the silence fill the cabin again, pressing around her shoulders. She hated how powerless she felt, how every instinct told her to run even though her body barely held together. Minutes dragged until they felt like hours. Finally, she heard distant hoofbeats, not outside the cabin, but approaching fast from the trail leading through the pines. Panic surged through her chest. She grabbed the edge of the table, pulling herself up even though her ribs protested violently. The sound grew louder. Then, suddenly, Elias's voice. But it wasn't shouting, it wasn't panicked. It was calm, familiar. Another voice answered him, a woman's voice. Clara froze. The door opened, and a rush of cold air entered as Ruth Walker, Elias's younger sister, stepped inside with a saddlebag over her shoulder. Her cheeks were bright from the cold, and her brown hair was half-pinned, half-windblown beneath a wool hat. She had the steady, assessing eyes of someone who'd seen more hardship than her warm smile suggested. When she spotted Clara, her smile gentled into something softer, more careful. "Goodness," Ruth murmured, stepping closer. "You must be Clara. Elias sent word last time I visited the clinic that someone might need help if the winter got bad. But he didn't say anything about rescuing anyone from a storm." Clara swallowed, unsure how to respond. Her instincts still told her to stay guarded, but Ruth's presence, her easy posture, her confident tone, made something loosen in Clara's chest. Ruth knelt beside her. "How's your breathing? Any dizziness? Pain in the ribs?" Clara nodded slightly. "All of it." "Well, that's honest," Ruth said with a small smile. "Let's see what we're working with." Her hands were gentle but efficient as she checked Clara's pulse, pressed lightly along her side, and inspected the bruises. "You're healing, but slowly. Another few days of rest, warm food, and staying off your feet will help." Clara nodded again, grateful and embarrassed at the same time. "I'm sorry you had to come all this way. I didn't mean to cause trouble for anyone." Ruth shook her head. "Trouble has a way of finding people who don't deserve it. But you're safe here, Clara. Elias knows what he's doing." Outside, Elias stomped snow from his boots. His expression was tight when he shut the door. "The tracks on the ridge are fresh," he said. 3 horses, same direction we heard earlier." Clara stiffened. Ruth looked between them. "Who are they?" Clara hesitated, but Elias nodded, urging her silently to speak. "Outlaws," Clara whispered. "Silas Brock and his men. They took me from my town. I escaped in the storm." Ruth's jaw set. "I've heard that name. Stories reach Sheridan, none of them good." Clara clasped the blanket around herself. "They'll come here. They always finish what they start." Elias leaned his rifle against the wall. "We're not letting them through that door, and they won't take you again." Clara looked down at her trembling hands. "I shouldn't have come here. If they find me, they'll hurt anyone standing in their way." "Listen," Ruth said, placing a firm hand on Clara's shoulder. "You didn't choose this. People who choose to hurt others are the ones responsible, not you. Remember that." Clara tried to breathe through the swell of emotion clogging her throat. Elias walked to the window, lifting the curtain an inch. The light outside was fading into the pale blue of late afternoon, shadows lengthening across the snow. The ridge beyond the cabin seemed to loom larger, darker. "They're close," he murmured. Ruth followed his gaze. "How soon?" "Hard to say. Maybe hours, maybe less." Ruth turned back to Clara. "We'll prepare. There are things we can do before they arrive." Clara's pulse pounded. "Prepare how?" "First," Elias said, "we barricade the windows. Second, we check the barn and make sure the horses are inside. Third—" He paused, his voice lowering. We plan for what happens if they try to force their way in. Clara's breath shook. Fear curled inside her stomach, but something else rose with it, an ember of determination. For the first time in days, she wasn't facing the danger alone. Ruth stood, rolling up her sleeves. Let's get to work. Clara watched Elias and Ruth begin moving through the cabin with practiced coordination. Ruth sealed drafts in the walls while Elias secured the shutters. Their movements were efficient, steady, almost comforting. It made Clara's heart ache in a strange, unfamiliar way, because this sense of being protected, of being worth protecting, was something she'd forgotten how to feel. Outside, the last light faded over the Bighorn Mountains. The valley darkened, and with the coming night came the promise of movement. Shapes on horseback, men following tracks through snow. The danger was no longer distant. It was drawing closer with every mile, every breath. And by the time morning came, Clara sensed that everything she feared and everything she hoped would collide at the cabin door. Night settled over the valley like a heavy curtain, sealing the cabin in darkness broken only by the thin glow of lantern light. The air outside had sharpened to a biting cold, the kind that made even the trees stand rigid and silent. Inside, tension wound through every corner like an invisible thread. Elias, Ruth, and Clara were each caught in their own thoughts, yet all of them listened for the same thing, the unmistakable sound of hooves cutting through snow. Elias tightened the last shutter over the back window, pressing his weight against the wood until he felt it lock into place. The cabin wasn't built for battle, but it was sturdy, reinforced over years of harsh winters. It would hold, at least long enough for them to act if the outlaws arrived. Ruth finished stacking crates near the front door, forming a makeshift barricade. She dusted her hands off and shot Elias a look that was both practical and grim. "If they come tonight, they'll expect us to panic," she said. "So we won't." Elias nodded, but Clara's breath hitched softly. She sat near the hearth again, hugging the blanket to her chest, though the fire was warm enough to keep the room from freezing. Ruth noticed and crouched beside her. "You're doing well," Ruth said gently. "You survived what most people wouldn't, and you're not alone anymore." Clara nodded, though her eyes were distant. She wasn't thinking about survival. She was thinking about Silas, his hands, his voice, the way he'd looked at her like she was a thing to break. The memory sat like ice in her spine. Elias joined them, pulling a stool close. "Clara," he said carefully, "there's something I need to ask you." She looked up, wary but listening. "How much do they know about you? Would they recognize this area? Would they know what direction you ran in the storm?" Clara tightened her grip on the blanket. "Silas isn't stupid. He watches the ground, the sky, everything. He knows where the wind drifts snow. He knows how far a person can travel half frozen. And Mason, he follows tracks for sport." Her voice cracked. "They'll come here." Elias exchanged a look with Ruth. Both siblings understood what that meant. Danger was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. "We'll be ready," Elias said. Clara shook her head. "You don't understand. Silas doesn't negotiate. He doesn't leave survivors. And we don't abandon people," Ruth replied firmly. "That's the difference." Clara closed her eyes, fighting tears. Not from fear this time, but from a swelling ache she didn't recognize. Gratitude mixed with a sharp disbelief that anyone would choose to protect her. Elias stood and crossed to the cabinet where he kept supplies. He pulled out 2 rifles, checking the chambers with practiced movements. Ruth took one without hesitation, loading it with steady hands. "Do either of you have experience with weapons?" Clara asked softly. Ruth smiled faintly. "I grew up in a mining town. You learn quick when coyotes circle the livestock." Elias added, "And when your younger sister insists on riding into trouble every other season." Ruth nudged him with her elbow, and for a moment, a small warmth flickered between them. One Clara felt, but couldn't yet fully understand. She watched them work together, their movements smooth from years of shared hardship. It struck her then how much she wanted something like that. Connection, trust, a place where she wasn't running from shadows. The thought hurt. Elias finished preparing the rifles and set one near the front window. "Clara, if they come, you stay behind the table. Don't try to run outside again, not in your condition." She nodded, cheeks flushed with the sting of helplessness. "I hate hiding." "You're not hiding," he said gently. "You're staying alive." A soft sound echoed outside, a distant crunch, like snow shifting under weight. Ruth and Elias both paused, exchanging another look. Ruth crossed to the window and lifted the corner of the shutter just enough to peer through a sliver. "I don't see anything," she whispered. Elias moved beside her. Could be an animal. But the way his shoulders stiffened told Clara he didn't believe it. He reached for his coat. "I'm checking the yard." Clara stood abruptly. "No. Elias, please, don't go out there alone. If someone's out there, I need to know how close they've gotten." Ruth grabbed her gloves. "Then you're not going alone." Elias opened his mouth to argue, but Ruth's eyes flashed the stubbornness of a woman who had out-reasoned him 1,000 times before. Clara felt panic coil inside her. What if it's them? What if they're already waiting? Elias hesitated at the door, then turned to her. "I'll be careful." Careful. The word meant nothing against men like Silas. Still, Clara stepped aside, breath shaking. Elias and Ruth slipped out into the cold. The wind cut at their coats as they moved across the yard, lantern lights spilling over the snow in trembling gold. Clara pressed herself to the window, watching them disappear toward the barn. Minutes crawled by, each one louder in her mind than the last. Finally, footsteps, quick, heavy. Clara's heart dropped. Ruth burst through the door first, followed by Elias. Both looked pale. "What did you see?" Clara whispered. Elias shut the door hard. "Tracks!" Ruth locked the bolt. "Fresh!" Clara's pulse hammered. "How many?" "3 horses," Elias said, voice low. "Coming from the north ridge. They stopped at the tree line. And then..." His jaw tightened. "They circled," Ruth added. "They're watching the cabin." A trembling silence swept through the room. Clara felt her knees weaken. "They found me." Elias moved toward her before she collapsed. "We don't know that yet." "Yes," she whispered. "We do." Ruth inhaled slowly. If they're circling, they're waiting for something. Waiting for night to set in fully. Elias looked toward the shuttered windows. "Then we have until dawn." He met Clara's eyes. "And whatever happens before then, we face together." Clara's fear didn't vanish, but for the first time since the storm, it didn't crush her either. Because the fight that was coming wasn't hers alone anymore. It belonged to all 3 of them. The cabin felt smaller as the night deepened. The lantern cast long shadows that trembled across the walls, stretching and recoiling like nervous hands. Outside, the cold sharpened into something metallic, something that carried sound too clearly. Every crack of ice, every shift of wind, every distant echo. Clara sat at the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in front of her as if holding them together might hold back her fear. She could feel the danger moving in the darkness, circling like wolves around wounded prey, and she hated that she was the reason the danger had come. Elias paced near the front door, restless. He wasn't the kind of man who feared confrontation, but he respected it. He knew what three armed outlaws could do if they decided to attack. He also knew the cabin wasn't built for a fight, no matter how many shutters he reinforced or crates he stacked. Ruth, calm as always, checked the rifles once more. "The rounds are good," she said. "We have enough ammunition for a standoff, but not a siege." Elias stopped pacing. "They won't try a siege. They'll rush in fast and brutal. That's their style." Clara flinched. She remembered too well. Ruth crossed to her and sat down. "Look at me," she said softly. Clara raised her eyes. "You survived them once. Not because you were lucky. Because you were strong enough to run, even half frozen and hurt. That strength didn't disappear." Clara tried to smile, but couldn't. "I don't feel strong." "Strength isn't a feeling," Ruth answered. "It's a choice." Before Clara could respond, Elias raised a hand. "Quiet." They all froze. From outside came the slow, deliberate crunch of snow under a heavy boot. Once, twice, then silence. Ruth whispered, "They're testing the perimeter." Clara felt her heart in her throat. Elias moved to the window and lifted the shutter a fraction of an inch. Through that narrow gap, he scanned the tree line. Trees stood black against the snow, unmoving. Nothing else shifted. Then, from somewhere near the back of the cabin, a low whistle cut the air. A signal. Ruth's hand tightened on her rifle. "They're communicating." Clara's breath shuddered. "They're going to surround us." "They already have," Elias murmured. A moment later, a voice carried through the night. Smooth, mocking, unmistakable. "Well now," Silas Brock called. "Seems we found something worth the cold after all." Clara almost collapsed. Ruth steadied her with a hand on her back. Elias's expression hardened like stone. He stepped closer to the window, but didn't open the shutter. Silas continued, his voice drifting lazily around the cabin as if he were strolling through a garden and not hunting human beings. "Clara Whitmore, you gave us quite the chase, but you knew we'd catch up eventually." Ruth muttered, "The arrogance of a rattlesnake." Elias called back, "You've got no business here." Silas laughed, slow and amused. "That's where you're wrong. You've got something of mine." Clara felt sick. She didn't want Elias speaking to Silas. She didn't want Silas's voice polluting the air inside the cabin. Mason's voice followed, sharp like broken glass. "She fought us. She stabbed Jonas. Took a piece of his ear. That ain't something a man forgets." Clara squeezed her eyes shut. The memory burned through her like acid. She hadn't meant to stab Jonas. She just wanted to live. Ruth whispered, "Don't listen to them." But the third voice joined in, Jonas limping, breath wheezing. "We ain't leavin' without her." Elias stepped back from the window. He didn't want them learning the layout of the cabin by baiting him into conversation. "Stay away from the walls," he ordered quietly. "If they shoot, it'll be through the thin spots." Ruth pulled Clara toward the table barricade. "Here, sit. Stay low." Clara did, though she felt as if the floor might disappear beneath her at any moment. Her hands shook uncontrollably. Outside, Silas's voice returned. "You've got till dawn. Hand her over nice and calm, and maybe we'll leave the rest of you alive." Ruth scoffed. "Liar." Elias didn't reply. He simply stood near the window, listening, judging the distance, the number of footsteps, the rhythm of breath in the cold. The outlaws didn't shoot. Not yet. They were waiting. watching. Letting the fear settle into the cabin like a poison gas, Clara whispered. They want me to break. Ruth shook her head. Then don't. But Elias, Ruth, you shouldn't die for me. Elias turned. His voice was steady, even gentle. We're not dying for you. We're doing what's right. Clara's throat tightened. No one had ever said words like that to her. Elias added, We have a few hours. We'll use them. Ruth nodded. We need a plan. Something that uses the terrain. Elias grabbed a rough map from the shelf. Just a charcoal sketch of the valley, but enough to work with. He spread it on the table beside Clara. There's a narrow ravine behind the cabin, he said. Steep on both sides. If we force them into it, they'll have no cover. Ruth leaned over the map. But how do we draw them there? We don't, Elias said. We escape into it. Clara stared, confused. Escape? In the dark? It's riskier staying here, Elias replied. This cabin won't hold against 3 armed men who know what they're doing, Ruth nodded. We wait for the right moment, just before dawn when their guard slips. We slip out the back, move fast, and disappear into the ravine. Clara's ribs throbbed. I can't run. Not far. Ruth's hand closed over hers. Then we won't run. We'll move slow if we have to, but we'll move together. Outside, snow shifted again. A boot dragged. A branch snapped. The outlaws were still there, circling, waiting. Clara looked between Elias and Ruth. Their calm, their determination, their unspoken certainty that she mattered enough to fight for. Something broke inside her then, not in pain, but in surrender. Not to Silas, but to the truth. She wanted to live, and she wanted to fight for that chance. With them. Elias lowered the lantern flame. Get some rest if you can, he said. Dawn is our opening. Clara nodded, though she doubted sleep would come. Still, she leaned back against the wall, breathing slowly, letting the warmth of the fire soften the ice inside her. Outside, 3 shadows stood in the tree line. Inside, 3 hearts beat with a single purpose. And as the night stretched on, the line between survival and fate narrowed to a blade's edge, one that dawn would sharpen. The hours before dawn were the slowest Clara had ever lived through. Darkness pressed against the cabin walls like a living thing, thick and heavy, carrying the weight of 3 men waiting just beyond the trees. Elias kept the lantern low, its flame barely more than a whisper of gold. Ruth sat near the table barricade, rifle resting across her knees, gaze steady and unblinking. Clara listened to the crackle of dying embers and tried to slow her breathing. Her ribs ached with every inhale, but pain wasn't what made her chest tight. It was the knowledge that the next hours would decide everything, whether she lived, whether Elias and Ruth survived, whether Silas Brock finally got what he believed belonged to him. Elias knelt by the back door, tightening the strap on his pack. When we go, he whispered. We stay low and move fast. The ravine will give us cover. Ruth nodded. Once we reach it, visibility drops. They won't have a clean shot. Clara gripped the blanket around her shoulders. What if they hear us leaving? Then we adapt, Elias said simply. But waiting inside this cabin guarantees we lose. Clara swallowed hard. She trusted him, more than she should, more than she understood. And Ruth, steady as a mountain stream, brought a calm Clara clung to like a lifeline. A faint sound outside made all 3 freeze, snow shifting, a slow, deliberate step. Ruth moved to the shutter and lifted it a hair. Her face tightened. They're closer, maybe 30 yards. Clara's pulse hammered. Elias extinguished the lantern entirely. Darkness swallowed the room, leaving only the faintest glow from the dying fire. Ruth whispered, "We go now." Elias opened the back door just enough to let cold air seep in. It bit at Clara's skin, sharp and merciless, but it also carried silence. A silence that said the outlaws were still in front, still watching the doorway they expected prey to flee through. "Stay behind me," Elias murmured. Clara nodded, tucking the blanket tighter. She stepped into the snow, boots sinking deep into the soft crust. The night air clawed at her lungs. Behind her, Ruth closed the door without a sound. The three moved quickly, hugging the cabin wall until they reached the shadows cast by the pines. Every breath felt too loud. Every crunch of snow beneath their boots felt like an alarm. Elias led them toward the narrow path that curved behind the ridge. Clara followed, each step sending pain through her ribs, but she never slowed. In the stillness of the pre-dawn dark, the sound of her heartbeat nearly drowned out the world. Then, a shout cut through the silence. "There!" Clara froze. She knew that voice. Mason. Elias grabbed her wrist. "Run!" They plunged forward just as a gunshot split the air. Snow burst beside Clara's leg. Another shot cracked from the tree line. Ruth turned, firing one precise round that sent sparks flying off a rock. The outlaws cursed. "Keep moving!" Ruth hissed. The ravine's entrance appeared ahead, a dark slit between two rising walls of rock. Elias guided Clara into it first, shielding her with his body as another bullet ricocheted off the stone face. Inside the ravine, the world narrowed. The wind died. The cold intensified. Shadows swallowed the three of them, but the rocks gave cover. Somewhere to hide. Somewhere to breathe. Elias crouched behind a boulder and motioned for Clara and Ruth to do the same. His voice was a low rumble. "They can't rush us in here. Too narrow." Ruth reloaded with quick, practiced motions. "But they can pin us." Clara leaned against the rock, breath trembling. The pain in her ribs pulsed with her heartbeat. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You shouldn't be risking your lives for me." Elias looked at her, eyes steady despite the danger pressing in around them. "We're not risking our lives for you. We're risking them because it's right," Ruth added. "And because Silas doesn't get to decide who lives and who doesn't." Clara's eyes burned. She didn't feel like a burden for the first time since this nightmare began. Movement sounded near the entrance of the ravine. Slow steps, careful steps, the steps of men who knew how to stalk. Elias raised his rifle. Ruth did the same. Clara gathered what courage she had left. She straightened, ignoring the pain slicing through her ribs. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "Not unless we make them." Elias glanced at her, surprised, then proud. Ruth nodded once. "Then that's what we'll do." The first sliver of dawn began to creep across the sky, a thin streak of pale gold breaking through the shadows. And Clara knew the coming light would reveal more than just the path ahead. It would reveal who she was now, who she was becoming, and whether she would survive long enough to step into that light. The ravine grew colder as dawn crept across the mountains, turning the snow a muted shade of blue. Clara pressed her back against the rough stone, shivering as the early light revealed the narrow path winding deeper between the cliffs. Elias and Ruth crouched nearby, scanning the entrance for movement. The outlaws had gone silent, but silence from men like Silas Brock was never a mercy. It was a strategy. Elias motioned for Clara to stay low. "They'll try to flush us out. Be ready." Clara nodded, clutching the small revolver Ruth had given her. It felt heavier than any weapon she'd ever held, but the weight anchored her, reminded her she wasn't helpless anymore. Wind funneled through the ravine, carrying faint echoes. A boot scraped against rock, then another. The outlaws were approaching, methodical, patient, confident that they could corner their prey at their own pace. Ruth leaned toward Elias. "We should shift positions. If they enter from the right side, they'll see us too fast." "No," Elias whispered. "We hold here. The rocks give cover. If we move deeper, we lose sight, and they gain it." Clara listened, absorbing every word. Her breath formed pale clouds in front of her face, each one trembling with nerves she couldn't hide. But underneath the fear was something sharper, resolve. Her voice was low. "Silas won't expect resistance this early. He thinks I'll be too scared to fight." Elias met her eyes. "Let him underestimate you." Before Clara could answer, a voice echoed through the ravine, smooth, drawling, dangerously confident. "Clara," Silas called, "you're making this far more interesting than it needs to be." Ruth raised her rifle, jaw tight. "He's close." Silas kept talking, his tone light, amused. "Thought you'd freeze to death out there. Shame you didn't. Would have saved us all the trouble." Clara's grip tightened around the revolver. Every muscle in her body tensed. Elias whispered, "Don't react to his words. That's what he wants." But Silas wasn't finished. "You remember what I told you?" he continued. "That spirit of yours would get you hurt?" A pause, a soft chuckle. "Guess I was right." Ruth muttered under her breath, "Coward." Elias signaled for silence. The crunch of snow drew closer, slower, heavier. One set of footsteps, then two more behind it. The outlaws were spreading across the entrance. Clara steadied her breathing. She forced her shoulders back, even as pain shot through her ribs. She wouldn't let Silas see her break. Not again. Suddenly, a rifle barrel appeared around the corner of the rock face. Jonas Pike's limp made his silhouette unmistakable. He leaned forward, scanning the ravine. Ruth fired first. Her bullet struck the rock inches from Jonas's head. He cursed and stumbled back, slipping on ice. Mason shouted, rushing to cover him. Elias grabbed Clara's arm. "Move!" They scrambled deeper into the ravine just as a volley of gunfire cracked through the air. Snow burst into clouds. Chips of rock fell around them. Clara ducked, heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Ruth fired again, pinning the outlaws down long enough for Elias to pull Clara behind a wide boulder. "They're trying to trap us," Elias said. "We need a way out before they flank." Clara swallowed. "There's another path." Her voice shook but carried certainty. "When I escaped, I followed a different ridge before I fell. There's a narrow trail on the left side. It leads upward, steep but possible." Ruth's eyebrows lifted. "Why didn't you say that earlier?" "I didn't remember until now," Clara admitted. "Everything was a blur." Elias nodded. "We don't have another option." "Ruth." "I'll cover you," Ruth said. "But once you reach the rocks, you'll need to keep moving. I'll catch up." Clara panicked. "No, we stay together." Ruth put a firm hand on Clara's shoulder. "You make it out. That's the priority." Before Clara could protest, Mason's voice pierced the air. "There's nowhere to run, girl." Silas followed, calm and certain. "Come out now, Clara. I'll make it quick." Elias raised his rifle. "Ruth! Now!" Ruth fired toward the entrance with sharp precision. The outlaws ducked for cover as snow exploded around them. Elias grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her along the ravine wall, searching for the trail she mentioned. Clara spotted it, a narrow cut in the stone, half hidden by snowdrifts. There. They climbed, boots slipping on ice, fingers grasping at jagged stone. Clara's ribs burned with each movement, but she pushed through the pain. Below them, Mason shouted, "They're moving up! Go!" Gunfire erupted again. Bullets sparked against the stone inches from Clara's legs. Ruth fired back, buying them precious seconds. "Go!" she yelled. "I'll hold them! Just go!" Elias and Clara reached the top ledge, breaths sharp and ragged. Clara turned, eyes wide with fear. "Ruth!" "She'll make it," Elias said, "but we need to get higher before they corner her." The wind howled across the ridge, carrying with it the rising chaos below. Shouts, gunshots, the ruthless determination of men who refused to let their prey slip away. Clara gripped Elias's hand, bracing herself against the cold and the terror still climbing behind them. The mountain would decide what came next, and dawn was only beginning to break. The ridge rose steep and narrow beneath Clara's boots, each step a battle against pain and freezing wind. The sky had begun to lighten, casting pale streaks of gold across the jagged rock. Dawn was coming fast, but so were the outlaws. Their shouts echoed up the ravine behind her, growing sharper, closer. Elias climbed ahead, turning back every few seconds to make sure Clara was still with him. Her breath came in tight, pained bursts, but her eyes held something he hadn't seen before, determination stronger than fear. "Almost there," Elias whispered. "Just a few more yards." Below them a shot rang out. Clara's heart dropped. "Ruth!" Elias grabbed her arm. "Don't look back. Ruth knows how to move. She'll catch up." Clara didn't fully believe it, but she forced her legs to keep moving. Snow crunched beneath her boots. Her ribs screamed with every pull of muscle, but stopping meant dying, or worse, going back with Silas Brock. A voice rose from below, puncturing the cold air. "Clara!" Silas shouted. "You're only making this harder on yourself." Mason added, "Run all you want. We'll catch you." Their words slithered up the rocks like poison. Clara clenched her teeth, pushing harder. Elias stopped suddenly, raising a hand. "Hear that?" Clara paused, chest heaving. Another sound cut through the morning, rapid footsteps, lighter than the outlaws, approaching fast. Then Ruth appeared, scrambling up the ridge, face flushed, hair whipping in the wind. Relief washed over Clara so strongly she nearly collapsed. "You made it," Clara breathed. Ruth grinned despite her panting. "Told you I would." But her smile faded as gunfire cracked again below. "We don't have much time." Elias pointed to the path ahead. "There's a narrow cut along the ridge side. If we can reach it, they won't be able to follow without exposing themselves." Ruth nodded. "Then that's where we make our stand." The three moved quickly, weaving along the ridge as the sky brightened into a pale morning blue. Snow glittered across the peaks, beautiful and merciless. Below, the outlaws scrambled after them, Silas in the lead, Mason and Jonas flanking him like wolves scenting blood. Ruth tightened her grip on her rifle. "They're gaining." Clara's legs felt weak, but something burned inside her that refused to quit. "We keep going. We have to." Finally, they reached the narrow cut, a ledge barely wide enough for one person at a time, with a drop so steep the valley below looked like a distant dream. Elias stepped onto it first, guiding Clara behind him, Ruth following last. They moved in single file, boots sliding on loose snow. Far below, the outlaws reached the base of the ridge. Silas cupped his hands around his mouth. "You can't run forever, Clara. We'll find you," Ruth whispered. He sure talks a lot for someone who couldn't catch a half-frozen woman in a storm. Elias shot her a look that was half warning, half amusement. Focus. They reached a small alcove carved naturally into the rock, a pocket of space wide enough to shelter them, but narrow enough to funnel anyone approaching. Elias motioned for them to take position. "We hold them here." Clara pressed her back to the wall. She felt the stone's chill seep through her clothes. Every breath hurt, but she didn't complain. Not now. Not when everything led to this moment. Below, Jonas tried climbing first. His limp slowed him, but his determination was cruel. Ruth took aim, but waited. Jonas was still shielded by the rock. "Wait," Elias whispered. "Silas will push one of them into the open." He was right. Silas shouted, "Move faster, Jonas! Earn your keep!" Jonas cursed and climbed higher, straight into view. Ruth fired. Jonas fell backward, tumbling down the ridge with a cry that echoed until it vanished. Clara gasped. She hadn't wanted blood, only safety. But this was the only line between living and being dragged back into darkness. Mason shouted, "You'll pay for that!" He climbed next, firing blindly. Bullets sparked against stone. Clara ducked, heart pounding. Elias returned fire, forcing Mason to press himself against the rocks. Silas stayed below, eyes sharp, calculating. "You're only delaying the inevitable," he yelled. "She belongs to me." Clara's breath trembled, but not from fear. Something inside her ignited. A fire she didn't know she still had. She stood, gripping her revolver with both hands. "I don't belong to you," she whispered, though her voice shook. Silas heard. "What was that?" Clara stepped forward, leaning past Elias's shoulder just enough to see down the ridge. "I said, I don't belong to you." Her voice carried through the ravine. Silas's expression twisted into something dark. "You will." Elias pushed Clara gently behind him. "He won't get past us. Not today." The wind picked up, icy and wild, whipping snow around them like shards of glass. Mason tried again to climb. Ruth fired again, grazed him. He fell back, howling. Silas growled, "Cowards!" Elias steadied his rifle. "He's losing patience." Ruth reloaded. "Good. Angry men make stupid choices." Clara stared down the ridge, gripping her gun. She wasn't strong. She wasn't trained. But she wasn't that terrified girl tied to a saddle anymore. If this was going to end, she wanted it to end with her choosing her own fate. Silas shouted one final warning. "When I get up there, girl." But he never finished. At that moment, the sun crested the mountain peak. Light burst over the ridge, and the final confrontation began. The sun rose over the Bighorn Mountains like a blade of gold, slicing through the last shadows of night. Its light spilled across the ridge, catching on the snow, the jagged rocks, and the three figures standing in the narrow alcove. Clara stood between Elias and Ruth, chest tight, breath trembling, her revolver cold in her hand. Down below, Silas Brock shielded his eyes from the sudden brightness. The sunlight revealed the fury etched across his face, raw, violent, unrestrained. Mason crouched behind a rock, swearing under his breath as he tried to load another round. Jonas was gone, fallen to the ravine floor in the previous clash. Only 2 outlaws remained, but 2 were enough. Elias steadied his rifle. "Stay behind the line," he murmured to Clara. Ruth raised hers beside him. "This ends now." Silas's voice boomed up the ridge. "You think daylight changes anything? You think hiding behind those rocks will save you?" Clara stepped forward before Elias could stop her. She felt the cold wind burn her cheeks, felt her ribs ache with every breath. but she also felt something stronger than fear. "No," Clara called back. "Daylight doesn't save us." Silas smirked. "Good. You're learning, girl." "But it exposes you," she finished. Silas's expression flickered, only for a second, but it was enough. Ruth whispered, "He didn't like that." Ruth nodded. "Then that's where we make our stand." The three moved quickly, weaving along the ridge as the sky brightened into a pale morning blue. Snow glittered across the peaks, beautiful and merciless. Below, the outlaws scrambled after them, Silas in the lead, Mason and Jonas flanking him like wolves scenting blood. Ruth tightened her grip on her rifle. "They're gaining." Clara's legs felt weak, but something burned inside her that refused to quit. "We keep going. We have to." Finally, they reached the narrow cut, a ledge barely wide enough for one person at a time, with a drop so steep the valley below looked like a distant dream. Elias stepped onto it first, guiding Clara behind him, Ruth following last. They moved in single file, boots sliding on loose snow. Far below, the outlaws reached the base of the ridge. Silas cupped his hands around his mouth. "You can't run forever, Clara. We'll find you," Ruth whispered. "He sure talks a lot for someone who couldn't catch a half-frozen woman in a storm." Elias shot her a look that was half warning, half amusement. "Focus." They reached a small alcove carved naturally into the rock, a pocket of space wide enough to shelter them, but narrow enough to funnel anyone approaching. Elias motioned for them to take position. "We hold them here." Clara pressed her back to the wall. She felt the stone's chill seep through her clothes. Every breath hurt, but she didn't complain. Not now. Not when everything led to this moment. Below, Jonas tried climbing first. His limp slowed him, but his determination was cruel. Ruth took aim, but waited. Jonas was still shielded by the rock. "Wait," Elias whispered. "Silas will push one of them into the open." He was right. Silas shouted, "Move faster, Jonas! Earn your keep!" Jonas cursed and climbed higher, straight into view. Ruth fired. Jonas fell backward, tumbling down the ridge with a cry that echoed until it vanished. Clara gasped. She hadn't wanted blood, only safety. But this was the only line between living and being dragged back into darkness. Mason shouted, "You'll pay for that!" He climbed next, firing blindly. Bullets sparked against stone. Clara ducked, heart pounding. Elias returned fire, forcing Mason to press himself against the rocks. Silas stayed below, eyes sharp, calculating. "You're only delaying the inevitable," he yelled. "She belongs to me." Clara's breath trembled, but not from fear. Something inside her ignited. A fire she didn't know she still had. She stood, gripping her revolver with both hands. "I don't belong to you," she whispered, though her voice shook. Silas heard. "What was that?" Clara stepped forward, leaning past Elias's shoulder just enough to see down the ridge. "I said, I don't belong to you." Her voice carried through the ravine. Silas's expression twisted into something dark. "You will." Elias pushed Clara gently behind him. "He won't get past us. Not today." The wind picked up, icy and wild, whipping snow around them like shards of glass. Mason tried again to climb. Ruth fired again, grazed him. He fell back, howling. Silas growled, "Cowards!" Elias steadied his rifle. "He's losing patience." Ruth reloaded. "Good. Angry men make stupid choices." Clara stared down the ridge, gripping her gun. She wasn't strong. She wasn't trained. But she wasn't that terrified girl tied to a saddle anymore. If this was going to end, she wanted it to end with her choosing her own fate. Silas shouted one final warning. "When I get up there, girl." But he never finished. At that moment, the sun crested the mountain peak. Light burst over the ridge, and the final confrontation began. The sun rose over the Bighorn Mountains like a blade of gold, slicing through the last shadows of night. Its light spilled across the ridge, catching on the snow, the jagged rocks, and the three figures standing in the narrow alcove. Clara stood between Elias and Ruth, chest tight, breath trembling, her revolver cold in her hand. Down below, Silas Brock shielded his eyes from the sudden brightness. The sunlight revealed the fury etched across his face, raw, violent, unrestrained. Mason crouched behind a rock, swearing under his breath as he tried to load another round. Jonas was gone, fallen to the ravine floor in the previous clash. Only 2 outlaws remained, but 2 were enough. Elias steadied his rifle. "Stay behind the line," he murmured to Clara. Ruth raised hers beside him. "This ends now." Silas's voice boomed up the ridge. "You think daylight changes anything? You think hiding behind those rocks will save you?" Clara stepped forward before Elias could stop her. She felt the cold wind burn her cheeks, felt her ribs ache with every breath, but she also felt something stronger than fear. "No," Clara called back. "Daylight doesn't save us." Silas smirked. "Good. You're learning, girl." "But it exposes you," she finished. Silas's expression flickered, only for a second, but it was enough. Ruth whispered, "He didn't like that." "What happens now?" she asked. Elias smiled faintly. "Whatever you want to happen." Clara looked toward the mountains glowing with sunrise, toward the valley where danger had once lurked, but no longer owned her future. She breathed deeply. "I want to live," she whispered. Elias reached for her hand. "Then we'll start there." And as the sun finally lifted above the Bighorn peaks, Clara felt, for the first time in a long, long while, like she was stepping into a life she could choose. A life filled with hope. A life that finally belonged to her. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.